Hi BookTube, welcome to a Sideline video. This is a buddy read edition. I've put up my usual stats slide, but it doesn't apply in the way you might think it's going to apply. While I've got here The Legend of Sleepy Hollow by Washington Irving, his famous story, well, probably his famous retelling of a story that predated him, but nevertheless, he got it published in 1819. I'm not putting this up because I'm going to do a review of the story as such. Let's explain. Meg at Books Off the Beaten Path, back in July, she showed off a book haul, and I got a little sneak preview of it because we do chat privately, and one of the books I saw was The Legend of Sleepy Hollow by Washington Irving, and I'd never read it. And I say never read, and of course Meg was quite shocked at this. I got to explain it to Meg. Never read, probably because it's the story that gets a lot of media adaptations, and it's almost treated in the same way fairy tales are. That is, multiple versions of the story are available in print, and I know we had a version of this story in our elementary school readers. You know, those readers that they always issued to kids if you grew up in the United States or Canada. You didn't read real books, you read readers which had all these extracts from books. And there were also cartoon versions when I was growing up. In fact, I know that there was a Scooby-Doo episode where the ghost was the good old headless horseman. That's the sense in which I have never read. That is, I've never gone back to the original text, even though I know the story. I know exactly what happens and the characters who are involved. And Meg is going to give you her version of this buddy read video, and I think she's probably going to talk more about the story. And I decided, you know what? After I read, the online edition, Internet Archive have the 1906 Bobbs Merrill edition, and you literally can page through its photographed pages from that edition, so you can see all the old illustrations and how the typeface sits on the page. It was really lovely. It was the closest thing you could get to having a vintage book. And I'm glad I went ahead and went to the source text just to see how Washington Irving could write. But I'm not going to talk much about the text or the writing itself, so that makes this stat slide a little misleading. I actually would really like to talk about Washington Irving. And I want to talk about the author because I suspect, I'm guessing, but I suspect that he's not as well known to people now as he was in his day. I don't think people understand what a celebrity Washington Irving was and why. Back in the early 19th century, he really made an impact, not only in the United States, but also in Europe, and particularly in England. And while it's true that he was named after the first president of the United States, and his family were very enthusiastic about the new nation that they became a part of, Washington himself spent a lot of time in other countries, and much of his writing was actually done when he was away from the 13 colonies. So let me talk about him, and I've got a lot of notes, so if you see me glancing to one side, that's me making sure I don't give you inaccurate information. Washington Irving was born in 1783, and he was born in the United States. However, his parents, they had come from the north of Scotland, and here I've got to talk about Washington's father, who was descended from William de Irving, who was secretary and armor-bearer to that famous Scottish hero, Robert the Bruce. Now, Robert the Bruce, and apologies to historians and history buffs who know this already, Robert the Bruce led the first war against England, against Edward I, good old Edward I that I read about. And he was trying to win back Scottish independence because Scotland had independent political existence and its own king. Edward I disrupted that, and Robert the Bruce was trying to restore the status quo. So maybe that inclination to be free from English rule somehow passed on through the genes. I don't know. For his services to Robert the Bruce, William became Laird of Drum. He got lands around Aberdeen, and that included Castle Drum. And the land stayed in the Irvine family until it was sold to the National Trust in 1973. But we need to stay in the past now, back with William de Irvine, who won all these lands because he served Robert the Bruce. His son settled in the Orkney Islands, which are just off the northernmost tip of the Scottish coast. There's a little cluster of islands, one of which is called Orkney, but the group of islands is often referred to as the Orkneys. And for many centuries, the Irvings who lived on Orkney were one of the leading families on the island. But by the mid-18th century, that fame and probably that wealth and the opportunities, they were waning a little bit. And so Washington Irving's father decided to join the Navy. It was one good way for young men in the mid-18th century to seek their fortune. It also was a good way to die young, but if you didn't die young, then you might acquire a lot of money. You might build up a good living from the plunder that you could take. The British Navy were very good pirates, but that's for another video, perhaps. Washington's father became a petty officer on a ship that was taking parcels from Falmouth in the south of England to New York, going back and forth, just doing a parcel run. And I don't know, maybe he became enamored with New York, because soon after he had married a local girl in Falmouth named Sarah, she and he emigrated to the American colonies. Washington's father, when he arrived in the United States, had a bit of a tough time in terms of his business, because he arrived a few years before the Revolutionary War, which of course led to the independence of the 13 colonies from England. But it was a time that was difficult if you were a small businessman, because sea routes were disrupted, and of course your ability to trade and move around even on land could be disrupted depending upon where the fighting was. Nevertheless, Washington's father's affection for the new country is clear, because he named one of his younger sons Washington, and he had a large family. Washington was one of the younger sons, and when he was very young, Washington had this love of the theater, and it wasn't shared by the rest of his family. It was a very religious family, so they looked down upon such amusements, but Washington was fascinated by that. He then went on, Washington did, to train to be a lawyer, but by his own admission, he didn't really learn much, and he never actually went into practice. He was interested in writing. Maybe this came from his love of the stage. And so together with two of his brothers, he started to produce a satirical magazine called Salmagundi, which you may know about if you know a little bit about Washington Irving. And there were only 20 issues of this magazine created and only 800 copies sold. However, it caused a sensation in New York for its writing. So he already, when he was very young, was gaining a reputation as a good, entertaining, popular writer. And so after that magazine, Washington decided he would step out and do a work of his own. And now I'm reading from a website called About Orkney, which was tracing the Irving family and gave quite a good biography of Washington and some of his exploits. So I'm quoting here from that website. He began his comic masterpiece, Dietrich Knickerbocker's History of New York, with his brother Peter, but when Peter was called to Liverpool on business shortly after they began, Washington continued alone. 6 weeks before publication, an ingenious publicity campaign began with a notice about a missing elderly gentleman called Dietrich Knickerbocker. This carried on with notices of him being seen and leaving a manuscript behind in his lodgings. The book was then published in December 1809. When Henry Brevoort sent Sir Walter Scott a copy of the second edition, Sir Walter wrote to him, quote, "I have been employed these 2 evenings in reading them aloud to Mrs. Scott and 2 ladies who are our guests, and our sides have been absolutely sore with laughing. I beg you will have the kindness to let me know when Mr. Irving takes pen in hand again." So Irving actually then later met Sir Walter Scott on a trip in 1815, stayed in Sir Walter Scott's home for a few days. The two men became fast, long-time friends, and Scott was able to later introduce Irving to his publisher in England, and that allowed Irving to become a published author on both sides of the Atlantic. And just a little aside, the surname Knickerbocker was invented by Irving, and anything that you see that is now called Knickerbocker dates back to that story. So including the lovely trousers that golfers used to wear, those ones that fastened at the knee. They became known as Knickerbockers because the character in Dietrich Knickerbocker's History of New York wore such trousers. Also, Knickerbocker Glory, which is an ice cream sundae-like dessert in the UK, that also dates back to this book. I haven't yet found out exactly how. All I understand is that any reference to Knickerbocker is a reference to this work of fiction that came out in the early 19th century. And this is what Irving is famous for, but I don't think people realize he's famous for. His books and stories were so popular that they entered the culture of the time, and references were created, and other artists used some of the things that were in Irving's books. And so effectively, Irving doesn't get credit for all the things that he has invented. And one of these is also St. Nicholas. That is our concept, our current, well, you say modern, but our modern concept of Santa Claus or St. Nicholas itself dates back into the 19th century, but we often don't understand where some of the references came from. In the book, Dietrich Knickerbocker, there was this description of St. Nicholas, and I'm quoting again now, so I'll put it on screen. "And lo, the good St. Nicholas came riding over the tops of the trees in that self-same wagon wherein he brings his yearly presents to children. The shrewd Van Cortlandt knew him by his broad hat and long pipe. The smoke from his pipe ascended into the air and spread like a cloud overhead, showing what New York should look like. When St. Nicholas had smoked his pipe, he twisted it in his hatband, and laying his finger beside his nose, gave the astonished Van Cortlandt a very significant look." So 2 new literary images were created with Dietrich Knickerbocker. One, this is claimed to be the first instance of St. Nicholas being described as having a flying vehicle. Also of him smoking a pipe. And if you will remember the famous poem, "The Night Before Christmas," 'twas the night before Christmas and all through the house, that one. That came out a few years later. And if you remember, the poem introduced the idea of St. Nicholas having a sleigh now with reindeer. That was a new idea, but it borrowed from Dietrich Knickerbocker because it was Knickerbocker's book that first mentioned St. Nicholas flying through the air in a vehicle. That had never been mentioned before. The poem borrowed that, turned the vehicle into a sleigh with reindeer, but it also has St. Nicholas smoking a pipe, and you'll remember laying his finger aside of his nose in the poem. That is a direct borrowing from Dietrich Knickerbocker. So Irving was the 19th century equivalent of a cultural influencer in a big way. But it doesn't stop there. The Legend of Sleepy Hollow appeared in a periodical that Irving started in 1819, which was called The Sketchbook of Geoffrey Crayon. And later those stories were all collected and published in America and England as a single book. And there's another claim to fame in there that is owed to Irving. Irving influenced Charles Dickens. Yes, he did. I'm quoting again from the About Orkney website. The most famous of Irving's British admirers led to his other influence on our Christmas celebrations. Not content with being Santa's godfather, Irving had a hand in the celebration of Christmas itself. In the sketchbook, he wrote an account of traveling by coach on Christmas Eve and spending Christmas Day at Brace Ridge Hall, the country seat of a friend's father. Some of the descriptions sound cliched, and there is a very good reason for this. It is where we get our image of the Victorian Christmas. Charles Dickens freely admitted that he used Irving's descriptions of old-style Christmas celebrations in Pickwick Papers and A Christmas Carol, the novel that had a profound and long-lasting effect on Christmas celebrations in Britain and America. Okay, and Dickens and Irving also became good friends. And here's a coincidence. One of Washington Irving's brothers was named Ebenezer. Now, did Scrooge give his character in A Christmas Carol that name as a literary tribute to his friend? I could also talk about a number of other European poets and writers that Irving met. What isn't well known about Irving is that he spent 17 years of his life away from the United States, traveling in Europe, somewhat in England, also in Spain and Portugal, and there may have been other countries, like Italy also. That was between 1815 and 1832. So between the ages of 35 and 52, he was not living in the United States. And he did receive some criticism in New York circles because his writings after the sketchbook were about countries in which he was living, in Europe, some aspect of their history or their contemporary life. And New Yorkers were saying, well, he's an American writer. Why isn't he writing about America? And yet nothing seemed to stop his work from selling really well on both sides of the Atlantic. He had a way. And in London, there is a blue plaque. For those of you who know, in the United Kingdom, there are blue plaques placed on buildings that have some historical significance. Someone famous lived there. And for 2 years, Washington Irving lived in a house at 8 Argyll Street in Soho in London, and there is a plaque there commemorating that. And greatest irony of all, and I got to say this, I'm so sorry, Meg, he was in London almost definitely when he wrote The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. What I'm hoping is that that has given some people a big insight into who Washington Irving was, just how popular he was, the reach of all his writings, many of which we don't really know about. The Legend of Sleepy Hollow is perhaps the only story that most people can associate with him, but he wrote much more, and it had a much bigger influence in his day. And when he died in 1859, here's some more trivia, in case you didn't know. The flags on shipping and also public buildings in New York, they all flew at half-mast on the day he died. 150 carriages made up his funeral procession in the city, and 1,000 people filed past his coffin. That's the kind of fame that he knew in the mid-19th century. And in 1876, Longfellow, the beloved American poet, wrote a poem titled The Churchyard at Tarrytown, which is the New York town where Irving lived from 1846 until he died. And I'd like to read that poem now. How sweet a life was his, how sweet a death, living to wing with mirth the weary hours, or with romantic tales the heart to cheer, dying to leave a memory like a breath of summers full of sunshine and showers, a grief and gladness in the atmosphere. And that is this Buddy Reed Sideline done. It may not be the last of Washington Irving's writings that I read. Now that I know what he was in his own time and some of his unrecognized contributions to literary and cultural tropes, I think he deserves more attention than he's getting on BookTube right now. What's coming up next on Heather Reads? Well, we have a fiction review happening this weekend, and then the weekend after that, it is another Middlemarch meditation. August is going to seem, I was going to say heavy for Middlemarch meditations, but it won't seem heavy to those of you who watch them. You will all know if you watch them that I was late in July. So one of July's meditations came out in August, and I just thought, I don't want people to lose out. I do 2 of them a month. I promise 2 of the month. I like to deliver 2 a month. So if that means doing 3 in August so that, we keep up with those numbers, so be it. It's hot again in the south of England. The weatherman said this is our 5th heat wave, but I've lost count. I hope you are all having good reading this month, and I hope to see you again in a few days' time. Take care. Bye-bye.